maybe I should tell you this now, just so you can work up to it. The symphony we're looking at or listening to tonight is about an hour long. It's 5 movements. Hugh and I were chatting yesterday about whether or not actually it'd be better to have a movement and then just talk about the next one and so on. I think we might do that just to break it up. And I've got a recording which is a filmed performance, a live performance. So that helps too, because there's something to look at and watch, and the soloist and the orchestra and so on. Once you sort of know what's going on, it's quite gripping. But I think it's a real issue. It's definitely an issue, and the sort of strolling habit and stuff definitely contributes to a lack of patience with things. However, I'm really not convinced by the whole, the agenda that this brings into, say, the pulpit or the classroom or whatever, about attention spans, and that we need to sort of dumb everything down or whatever it is. I just don't believe it. It entirely depends on what people are gripped by. So somebody can play a computer game for 9 hours straight and maybe have a quick loo break, but otherwise they're back, and their attention is undivided for those X hours. And so the capacity is still there. We can still do it. It just depends on whether or not we are gripped by it and we are willing to, make the sacrifices of maybe sort of sitting in one place for a whole period or whatever it is. But if you believe in it, then you're going to do it. Yeah.
I suppose I want to push that a little further and say that probably for most of us here, there's also a sense of needing to sort of retrain that focus. I think it's probably just worth saying that in order to say to anyone who might be finding that maybe a bit challenging. There's a certain sense of us just pushing, training our natural capacity that has been negatively impacted by tech in many ways, and developing it further, because the rewards for that, developing that further, the rewards in terms of being able to access some of these things are huge.
Yeah, I mean, a few of us were chatting around the fire last night that I think a good analogy for this is learning a new language. It's not a perfect analogy, but I think it's helpful. So if I go to France but don't speak a word of French, I'm going to be mystified by what people are saying all around me. And I know that they're all communicating with each other, but I'm out of it. There are sounds that mean nothing to me. And you have a choice then. You can say, okay, well, look, I don't get this. I'm going home. Fine. I mean, it's France. But or you say, I love France, by the way. Yeah, I did French A-level. Okay, you don't know. Or you say, oh no, well, okay, I'm going to invest in this. I'm going to try and learn some basic grammar and some vocab. And then gradually, with that investment, the awareness of what's going on will grow, and the discomfort and the sense of alienation will ease. And I think it's exactly the same with classical music. Apart from the fact that, you don't need to go on a big course before you can understand something. I think with music, there will be things that grab you almost immediately. But the thought of listening to one long composition that goes on for an hour and 6 minutes or whatever, with breaks, but if you know anything about the sort of etiquette of concert halls, you don't clap in between movements, and then somebody who does, and then everyone goes like this, and it's all part of the intimidating culture of it. Well, who cares if you clap with it between movements? It doesn't matter. But the thing is, you're not going to do that sort of accidentally. And if you're brought up and used to singles that are 3.5 minutes, and that is the ideal of the art form, the classic sort of Beatles single or whatever that fits on a small disc, then this seems utterly superfluous and over the top. And so it's not surprising, but I think it is about being intentional and say, okay, this is very foreign to me. I'm going to try and get one or two handles and just see what's going on and listen out for stuff. So in a sense, that's what we're trying to do, is say, okay, here's something that's going on. It's not the only thing, but listen out for that ticking clock. And then I didn't say anything about it, but it was picked up last night that, well, it slows down and then just peters out and it's gone. Well, you don't need a degree to work out what that means. It is what it is. But otherwise, you wouldn't have known to wait for that and think about it. So I suppose it's just a question of saying, right, okay, much of this might completely float over my head. And, you know, in a 15-minute movement, there's going to be a lot going on and it passes me by. Well, that's okay. You can fade in and out. It doesn't matter. It's not like a lecture. Well, it is like a lecture. You can fade in and out. Just be looking for those sort of catch points where you can, I can get back into the flow here. And that's okay. And if you just take one or two bits from it and then come back to it another time, you may be, oh, I see what that's doing there. And it's accumulative like that. But you've got to be intentional. Or you could do the thing, I don't want to learn French, I'm going home. Well, that's fine. Stick with Tay Tay.
I don't get the Tay Tay reference.
Taylor Swift.
Oh, is that right? Okay, that makes sense now.
That's what Swifties.
Well, funnily, if I was at that question, then 80% of what you would have so.
No, I think everybody knew.
Mark, that's really helpful, and I think it also means that what we're doing here
is broader than just music.
I absolutely agree.
It's actually it's something about. Someone said that one of the rarest, one of the most precious commodities in the contemporary world is attention, and so to focus attention, and even to begin to retrain our attention is good.
And actually, it's interesting, isn't it? I think we've been sold a kind of lie. And you see this in sort of, I think you saw this in the Queen biopic, the Freddie Mercury, what was it called? Bohemian Rhapsody. And the producer guy rejects the song initially because it's completely insane and huge and over the top, and he doesn't get it. And the assumption is that you'll just get it. Oh, that means it's great. And that's the catch of the old sort of 50s, 60s single. You'll get it, you'll buy the record. And I think we have this assumption that basically we will get what this painter is doing, what this TV show is. And it's very interesting, isn't it, how because of box sets and streaming now, and you have long form TV, it's liberated writers and directors to say, actually, we can be a bit mysterious. We don't have to lay it all on. I mean, if you look at the structure, this is a total red herring, but if you look at the structure of 70s detective shows, like Starsky and Hutch, which I used to love, basically the structure is identical every week. So you'll have a sort of intro, and then that will be sort of rounded off at the end. So you'll have these two little bits, and at the end, just before the credits, they'll all go, ha, 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 and then the credits will roll. And so that's tied up that thing. And then you'll have the storyline here as one developing line. And the whole thing is self-contained because you might not see it next week, and you can't video it. So if you don't see it when it's live, that's it. So it has to work as a standalone thing that's immediately accessible. The moment you have recording, VCR, or you can buy the box set, you don't need to do that because people start binging. And they can see, that they can notice that you sowed a seed in episode 2 that doesn't pay off until episode 14. Now, you could never do that before. But that is fascinating because it is assuming quite high standards of the audience to be able to figure that out. Now, many people just completely pass you by and you just enjoy it and just sort of sit sort of goggle-eyed in front of a box and just be brain dead. Fine, you can do that. But the point is that those who are crafting these things are assuming actually higher attention spans than we might imagine. And the great thing about the best TV is that it demands that of you. So I think The Wire, all 5 seasons, it slightly went down a bit, but it held its own. The Wire managed to do over 5 seasons something truly Dickensian. I really do think that. I think it is an extraordinary work of art, actually. And it's laying things over huge time spans that you really have to be quite a nerd to be able to see what they're doing. But when you see them, you think, wow. Breaking Bad and Better Call Saul do the same thing. It's just quite astonishing. Anyway, that is... That's all my fault. But thank you, Mark. No, it's a pleasure. Yeah, well, there we are. So let's talk about something completely different. Should I pray? Would someone like to pray for us? Someone like to pray? Or is that not something you do? Yeah.
Father, thank you for this time together. Thank you for Mark and all the time and thought that he's given to the things that he will share with us this morning. We pray, dear Lord, that you would direct his words and you would open our hearts and minds that we might grasp what you might say to us today, Lord, through all that is beautiful and mysterious and meaningful. Maybe be albeit enriched, blessed, Lord, by this time this morning. Thank you, Jesus. Amen.
Amen. Thank you. Well, I've got far too much in my notes to do, so I'm not going to cover everything. There is an outline of this talk in the folder, so check that out. I've put sort of suggestions for follow-up as well in that. I've been thinking a lot about, Mark's that email he got when Hugh first came, and it's a bit niche, which in a way is actually quite a polite way of putting it. In some minds, the idea that we would spend time thinking about music theologically is absurd and irrelevant. And you just think, well, what's that got to do with anything? And there are a number of reasons why that feeling would be around, and not just in churches, but we are much more, if we are evangelical, I would argue that we are much more modernist than we're biblical, than we care to realize, which is a very uncomfortable thing to face, because we thought we were being really faithful. And we thought we were onto the right track. And in some ways, perhaps we are. Great. But it's quite shocking to suddenly wake up to the fact that there are aspects of how we think and act and live that we thought were just, the natural outworking of our discipleship. When you suddenly have to realize, actually, that might be more to do with the surrounding culture that we live in than the gospel bearing fruit in my life. And I think one key area that this is very, very significant is the area of epistemology, knowledge. How do we know things? How do we know what we know? And what means do we have for knowing anything? Particularly, and I'm thinking in terms of truth, but actually it extends to justice and beauty as well. How do we recognize what is true as something that's true? And now, I'm not a philosopher at all, but this is a problem that actually really has beset thinkers for centuries. It was something that deeply troubled the Greeks and many others. And the journey is quite a complicated one. So I did this book, A Wilderness of Mirrors, that came out 10 years ago. And it grew out of just this recognition. So we'd lived in East Africa for a few years. I was teaching in a seminary. We come back to London. And even in the sort of 4 or 5 years we were away, I come back and notice things have changed. And that actually, or maybe it was we had changed and saw our culture more from the outside, and noticing that actually this stuff was really affecting the way we present the gospel. And one of the things that you see again and again, and I think as soon as I mention it, if you haven't thought about it before, you'll think, oh, okay, there's something in that. And that is that basically we live in a culture of suspicion. We are suspicious of pretty much everything now. Certainly we're suspicious of institutions and authorities, And the things that, say, British society over the last, I don't know, 400 years would look to and rely upon for making society work, whether it's the law or the police or the military or education or scientists or the church or you name it, hospitals. Actually, in recent years, one by one, it's almost been systematic, hasn't it? One by one, they've been exposed and shown up for being not quite what we thought they were. And, you know, if it's, you know, one scandal in a hospital selling, I don't know, all kinds of organs or whatever it is, it'll be this wretched thing that's hit the Church of England. I'm an ordained Anglican, and actually I used to do the camps where this guy John Smythe, who was beating people, I wasn't there at the same time as him, but I was part of that world. I went through the Macon report, which, you know, the sort of is 500 pages. I went through line by line. I know pretty much everybody in that report, and it's been brutal. It's just agony. But you look at that and you think, well, no wonder no one believes us. We say this, but look what's going on behind the scenes. But it's not just the kind of sort of succession of scandals and agonies. It's actually that there's been a philosophical shift that has meant that we have lost our confidence in how we know anything. And so I want to do a very sort of crude sort of overview of what's changed. And I think that will then show us a sense of why music has been totally relegated as, well, niche, if not irrelevant, let alone all the arts. And what I want to do in this session, and I've already run out of time, is give a sense of how actually all the arts are doing the same kind of thing, but within their unique frameworks. And so some people call it the epistemological divide. It's a horrible word. Don't use it in the pub. But basically, it's how we know what we know. And I think what happens is that we have split things up. And this is because of the Enlightenment. You know, this has been, well, from the 1600s onwards, it was sort of rumbling along. And, you know, Edinburgh was a key centre for it, Oxbridge, but also Paris and Philadelphia in the States. These were sort of hubs where people, very brilliant people, were talking and discussing and basically casting off the old shackles and saying, we're gonna create a new world, and we're going to do this in part by making human reason the absolute pinnacle of how we know. You reason something out, you figure it out. And so that means that we can cast off superstition and weird things like, you know, the principle of heredity, that basically the next ruler should be simply someone who's the son of the previous one. Yeah, that'll go well. So the whole principle of monarchy and aristocracy, that's, in rational terms, that's insane. Even if you have a really good monarch, what makes you think the next son, and it's usually the son, is going to be as good? And history shows, doesn't it, that actually that isn't always the case. Sometimes you have a good king followed by an absolutely rubbish one. Or a string of rubbish ones, and then out of the blue comes a Josiah. You think, oh, how did that happen? But there's nothing guaranteed about it. So you think, well, isn't it better to vote and see who we can choose or whatever? You know, and aristocracy goes in the same thing. But, you know, religion, you can't really prove that in the laboratory or whatever. So that's not reliable either. That is not rational. So on the one side, you begin to get the world of facts. And you think of the adjectives used for facts. It's things like scientific, physical, the physical world, the realm of truth. You know, we're dealing with fact. I want just the facts, ma'am. You know, it was that old TV show thing, detective show. Certainty. Yeah, we can be sure of this because we reasoned it out. Objectivity. It's objectively true. Water boils at 100 degrees in these circumstances, anywhere you're in the world. If you're at the same altitude, blah, 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 it has to be the same, obviously, but that is objectively true. We know 100 degrees. That's how centigrade is constructed as a metric. And so therefore, these are the things that we can, in quotes, all agree on, and that's what you use in the public square. So when we're having debates, even with people we disagree with, these are rock solid. They're the world, it's the world of facts, and it's the world of phenomena. The phenomenal. In other words, that doesn't mean, hey, wow, that's really awesome. It means it is the world of phenomena that you can notice, you can sense, you can measure. That's, in that context, is what it means. On the other side, you have the world of meaning. Now this is slightly different, isn't it? And these are things that are much harder to measure. So the world of religion, the religious world. In contrast to the physical world, you have the metaphysical. In other words, the beyond the physical, whatever that is. So it's suitably vague, and if you think about the word, it's defined by what it isn't. And you find a lot of things like this are defined by the negative. It's not finite, it's infinite. That's the negative of it. Well, we don't know what to call it, so we're just going to call it what it's not. It's the metaphysical, it's whatever's beyond. Who knows? And so this is the realm of faith, which is, well, I'm so glad you got faith. I don't, but isn't that lovely for you? This is over here, and that's what it means to you, and you understand the world like this, but it's not the world of facts. We can't share a sort of have a shared assumption about this. So isn't it better that you just keep that to yourself? And while we're in the public square, we're just going to deal with the stuff that's solid. It's the world of opinion and subjectivity. I mean, it's fascinating, isn't it, how so often when we're talking with friends and we're trying to talk about Christian truth, a response might be, oh, well, that's your opinion. And that's an interesting comment because it's not rejecting it, and there is a degree of respect to it, but it's a means by which you can dismiss it. You say, well, that's not my opinion. And so, well, let's move on. It's just subjective. Well, my subjective viewpoint is different, and I rely on the objective things. Well, yeah, right. These are private values. This should be kept to yourself. This is all classic Enlightenment thinking. And this is the world of the noumenal, which is, in philosophical terms, it's the opposite of the phenomenal. It's not about phenomena, things that you can measure. It's the sort of spiritual beyond. And, people talk about spiritual rather than religious these days, don't they? And it's basically anything that you can't quite define or measure, or that has a sort of a sort of heritage of thought and so on. It's just, it's very cozy and comforting and stuff. And who's to know? That's great for you. Doesn't work for me. But basically, all of this has happened as a result of Enlightenment thinking. Whereas before, 1500, the assumption was that there was no divide at all. I remember a very vivid illustration of this. I was quite soon into our time in Uganda, and I was walking down Kampala Road, the main street through Kampala, with my boss, who was the college principal, and we were going for lunch. And it was a very sort of simple thing, and literally a black cat crossed in front of us just as we were going along the pavement. No big deal. But Philip, my boss, just said to me, now, this is interesting, Mark, because what did you just see there? I said, I saw a black cat crossing our path. He said, what's the significance of that? I said, there isn't any. He said, exactly. You're a Westerner. You don't see any significance. Me, as an African, says, what's my grandfather telling me? Now, he's a Christian with a PhD in Christian philosophy. He says, I don't believe that. That's not how I think because I'm a Christian. But I was brought up, and that's the first thought that comes to me. And I have to process that. It was absolutely fascinating. And it's such a small little thing, but it's basically, this is the world he lives in. And he's a very sort of self-reflective guy, and he's thought a lot about these things. And he knows, no, that's not my grandfather. And it's not saying that the cat is the grandfather, by the way. It's just, it's a message, it's a sign. And it's sometimes said, the most important person in an African's life is, the most important relationship in an African person's life is that they have with their most recently deceased relatives. Which is completely different from us, isn't it? And you have to sort of process that. There are things about our lives that actually we instinctively think, but actually if we're thoughtful as Christians, we should say, actually, no, it's not like that. And this would be a case in point. So basically what the Enlightenment has done is it said, well, this stuff on the right, basically it's fine, but keep it yourself. It's less important. And so the arts fit here. This is the world of the arts. And, it gives you meaning perhaps, and it's beautiful or it's lovely. But, you can't define beauty, and this obsesses some sort of Enlightenment thinking. They want to have a clear, objective set of criteria for how we can tell what something is beautiful. In other words, in extremis, then you can sort of feed into a computer, and then the computer will tell you, okay, on these criteria, this thing is objectively beautiful. Well, it doesn't work like that. It's much more subjective. But that doesn't mean to say it's only subjective, because it's fascinating how, again and again, there are things that we find universally beautiful. There is something about a beautiful dawn or sunset. Why is that? Wherever you are, anywhere in the world, I guarantee you, people find that beautiful. That's not an accident. There is something objectively beautiful about that, but how do you put that into words and measure it? Well, I don't think you can. But you can say there are criteria, perhaps, yes. But the Enlightenment says, no, that's just not the realm of truth. That's just the realm of opinion and happy things like that. Now, what has happened, particularly from the Romantics onward, and I mean the Romantics in the technical sense, particularly starting with, the poets, the Lakeland poets, so Wordsworth and Coleridge, are saying, and they're seeing the devastation caused by Industrial Revolution. And the Industrial Revolution is a product of the left-hand column. It's maximizing efficiency, production, profit. And it's ingenious. I mean, there are things about technology and its application of science that work. Every time you get in an aeroplane, the Enlightenment works. That's one of Richard Dawkins' favourite things, isn't it? Show me a skeptic at 30,000 feet. You're there at 30,000 feet. And that is because science has been applied in technology into the world and it works. So it is powerful. But the mistake, and this is the classic thing all the way through, the mistake it always makes is a mistake of hubris. It's overweening. It is arrogantly assuming it is the only truth. It is reductionistic. I read an interview with a guy who I think is still alive, or maybe he's just died, I can't remember. James Houston was Scottish, was at Cambridge. Was he doing a master's? Anyway, he got to know C.S. Lewis quite well in Cambridge when Lewis, he would commute from Oxford for a few days at a time when he became a professor. Oxford never made him a professor and kind of scorned him, whereas Cambridge welcomed him with open arms and made him a professor of medieval English. And Houston, did he marry a Canadian? I can't remember, but for whatever reason, they knew they were going to move to Canada, and basically he was the founder of Regent College in Vancouver. So really quite a remarkable legacy, and he might be 100 if he's still alive, something like that. Anyway, so he was one of the very last people alive to have been taught by Lewis. He goes and has tea with him at the end. He knows, I think he's married by then, and so he knows that he and his wife are moving to Canada, and they didn't know when they were coming back, but he knew that actually he probably wouldn't see Lewis again. And so he sort of cheekily asked him. It's not the kind of question you necessarily ask somebody, in that sort of stature and status, but he asked him, so what has your life been about? What has been your life's work, would you say? Which is a fascinating question, especially of someone like that who's done so many different things. And he was expecting a sort of stroking of the chin and sucking on the beard, but not a bit of it. He responded immediately. He said, against reductionism. His life's work was against reductionism, against this. That's saying basically life can be reduced to equations and chemical formulae. And if you've read the science fiction trilogy of Lewis, you'll see that basically the baddies are the reductionists who are taking Enlightenment thinking to be exclusive to its logical extreme.
Mark, I don't know whether you're going to go there. Just it occurs to me that significant sections of the church, the evangelical church, have tried to live in that left-hand column that you've got. You're going there.
No, it's exactly right, because I would say evangelicalism, with its obsession with the word and propositions and statements, are basically prisoner to Enlightenment thinking that we are trying to hold our own in this enlightened world for very understandable reasons. It's a painful thing to be, but we're trying to say, no, look, you can respect us, you can respect our beliefs, because, we can do the same thing. We have our systematic theology, which is basically doing to theology what a physics textbook does to Newtonian physics. So you can systematize it, you've got your bullet points, and it's neat, it works, all right? And it's not that Newtonian physics is wrong until you get to the subatomic level. And even when you do get to the subatomic level, it does not negate Newtonian physics. Now, you may realize I don't have a Scooby of what I'm talking about. But basically, that is reality. There is much more mystery and weirdness to the physical realm than we ever dreamt. And it's fascinating now. If you went to your average Christian union in a university in this country in the 60s, the vast majority of students would be from the humanities. Very few from the hard sciences, except for maybe those who do applied science, as in the medics and the engineers. But those who are doing the sort of deep cosmological stuff, they don't want anything to do with religion, because that's over here. It's absolutely fascinating now. The exact opposite is true. It is the hard scientists who are flocking to faith. And it's the humanities that are really, literature degrees, history degrees, and then some of the soft sciences, sociology. These are the ones that have nothing to do with religion anymore. And in sociology, Christianity is now not just wrong, but dangerous. That's how people actually think. I've read transcripts recently of a discussion in a faculty, I think it was Birmingham maybe, and there was one Christian on the faculty, and there were some minutes from a discussion, and basically the assumption was, it hardly needed speaking, was that basically religion was dangerous, and so we needed to do everything we could to help people get out of it. The thing is, the 20th century has proved that actually this is very dangerous too. And look what the Enlightenment way of thinking has done to humanity, and look at what industry has done. When you apply industry to racism, you get the Holocaust. And it's no accident that some of the first so-called postmodern thinkers who were French, they all came out of the same stable. Do you know what stable they came out of, philosophically speaking? Anyone have an idea? So I'm talking about, well, first of all, you have Sartre and Camus and that lot, but then the real postmodernists, people like Derrida, Lyotard, Foucault. Where had they all come from philosophically? They had all been Marxist. And what killed Marxism was Stalin. There were believers who just held on and couldn't bear to give it up, but eventually even they had to recognize that basically Stalinism was a consistent outworking of that way of thinking, because in the end it's about power. And if these ideals are correct, then you have every reason to do whatever you need to do to bring them about. And if that means sending 20 million people to the gulag, so be it. Because they're just part of the collective. Individuals no longer matter. It's all about the people, whatever that is. And so the 20th century has seen a systematic sort of stripping away of the things that we trusted in such a way as to say, well, okay, we can't believe any of that crap. And you might think that at that point, okay, well, these post-Marxists, they're going to come flocking back to Jesus. No, not a bit of it. That's still part of the problem. They have assumed the critiques of religion from Marxism. They're not going back on those. So some of the premises of far left or far right thinking, they still maintain. They don't think they've been done away with. But they say, actually, no, the problem is, well, in the famous words of Lyotard, he says, I define the postmodern as incredulity towards meta-narratives. Incredulity towards meta-narratives. In other words, any time you present something as an overarching story that is true for everybody, you have committed some form of violence, and that is suspect. So you look at history, if it's medieval monarchy, or if it's the guild, or if it's the early nation state, or if it's the revolution, whether it's the French or the American or the Russian, whether it's Marxist or fascist or colonialist or whatever ist, it is oppressive because there are going to be people who don't fit. And so it might be because of their sexuality or because they're women or because of their colour. All of these isms will exclude somebody. And so now we need to give those excluded ones a voice. We need to listen to them. This is the origins of woke. And yet I utterly sympathise with that as a white, sort of dead white European male, privately educated, from a sort of colonialist family. My, various ancestors, and my father was in the British Army at the sort of end of colonialism. He was in Cyprus for years and Malaya and things. What on earth was he doing there in the British Army? Well, it was the empire. All right? Isn't that marvellous? And before you get too smug, actually the empire wouldn't have existed without the Scots. I just hope you realise that. Hong Kong was a Scottish city, apart from anything else, and various other things. But anyway, it's not a dig. But you see, the thing is, they've got a point. And so we're just going to be suspicious of all these things. And in the end, we're just going to sit with this. We're going to just enjoy our isolation and do our own thing and basically DIY, because there's nothing objective to lean on. It's all subjective. Now, as Christians, we want to say, no, 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 all the way through. The whole procession has been profoundly flawed. And that actually, often it's taken artists, and what time is it? Oh man, okay, yeah. Artists to really stop us in our tracks. And sometimes it's Christian artists who've thought about this and made a huge impact. And the person who is most significant for understanding this is Coleridge. Samuel Taylor Coleridge, writer of The Ancient Mariner, colleague of Wordsworth. if you go to Wordsworth Cottage in the Lakes, Dove Cottage, I went there with some friends and spent half a day there, and it was just absolutely fascinating. And apparently Wordsworth, all his life, would walk about 20 miles a day. He knew all the hills in the Lake District like the back of his hand. He just knew it all. He walked. I mean, you know, he was well off. He had a private income, so he could be a poet who just wanders around. But the point is that they were onto something. But what is so fascinating about both Wordsworth and Coleridge is that they were both arch romantics trying to find meaning in the natural world, but that in time proved insufficient. Both became very clear creedal Trinitarian Christians by the end of their lives. That's not a story you often hear, because the assumption is the Romantic movement won, and people assume it has still won. But here's the thing, particularly Coleridge understood that you can only figure out the world and your place in it if you hold both together in partnership, in dialogue, and avoid reductionism. So it's not just reason, and it's not just perception. It's not just the objective. Subjective has a part to play. The phenomenal and the noumenal, all these things. And actually, it's what the Bible's been saying all along. Now, the reason this matters, and actually it is important for music, is because it's saying, don't assume, therefore, that truth will only come from propositions, from statements. And the fascinating thing is, say, about the Bible is how much is poetry, and there you have an art form that is on the cusp between these two things. Because you could do an objective study of the words in a poem. You could get your OED and go through these words are defined X, Y, Z. Great. But you're going to miss so much if you've reduced the poem to that. Or if you try and give a summary statement, take a psalm like Psalm 130, and you say, this psalm, you know, basically, I was in a hole, God got me out, alleluia. Well, that's what the psalm is about. But you have lines like the watchman longs for the morning, like the watchman longs for the morning. You know, he repeats the same line twice. Well, what's the point of that? That's a waste of space. But the fact of repeating the same words, that has an affect. We are impacted by that repetition because you suddenly thought, oh, no, I just heard that. But, oh, you mean he's really longing for it. Do you see? And that actually the form is influencing the communication of the truth of it. I'm going to play you a setting of some words, if I've got time, which I think illustrates something of that actually by putting the words to music, there is a sense in which the experience of that truth comes home much more deeply. Now that's at its simplest form, where music draws out the meaning of words, and the combination is very powerful, more than either would be on their own. But actually, all art forms are doing that in different ways. But we are skeptical about it because we've believed this lie. But there are others in sort of the, say, more progressive Christian circles who would say, we've just got this on the right-hand side, and basically it's just about culture and being part of the culture and letting the culture speak to us and following that and so on. And it's all about, your own journey and stuff. You see this in the church as well. And of course, the evangelicals think this is appalling because this is a sort of absolute denial of everything they hold true and beautiful. But these guys are looking at them and saying, but look around you, wake up. This is an amazing world. It's too beautiful for bullet points. Let me just sort of pause there. I've gone a long way into this, but I think it's important because I think it'll help hopefully give a setting for why I think it is worth looking at music, even if it's by non-Christians and has nothing to do with religion per se. It is about how we perceive reality and truth. Does anyone want to come back at me on that or comment?
So it's where to start, really. In so much as that in the early part of your piece this morning, you were talking about organisations. And earlier to that, you made a comment about being an Anglican. So it just strikes me that everything that you're talking about is the result of, largely in my mind, a kind of post-Reformation schema that was itself predicated on dissent. We are not Catholic. Therefore, we will be something else. And you stated the credential of being Anglican. Jesus had a cousin, he was a Baptist. He never fitted. The first head to roll was his. Why? And it's because there are no such things as organizations. There are individuals and there are voices. And I don't think you've been hard on evangelicals, but I think you have brought a concept of evangelicalism that is largely the last 50 years and not the last 2000. And so the only thing I'm going to say as a response to what you're saying is that evangelicals will forever be defined by the narrative, by the historicity. The creed returns us to the historical entity of Pontius Pilate. There's a sense in which we as people of faith own the narrative that does not fit. To say no to Herodias is who we are. And therefore the sense with which the numinous, that which comes from out with ourselves, is the only true way to understand ourselves and the world in which we live. So my sense is that the limitations of part of what you're saying is, for me, given expression by your owning being an Anglican, and therefore you're seeing the dynamic of tradition as being very key inside how we interpret the humanities and the arts. Whereas a Baptist, I want to say, I'm going to allow myself to be influenced by a plain reading of the text that introduces me to a complex world that values the text before it values tradition.
I would certainly say I am that kind of Anglican, so I would definitely see myself relegating tradition to the scriptures. So I'm not a sort of woolly via media Anglican, I'm an evangelical Anglican. So I would certainly agree with you, and I think though the big flaw, and I think we could talk for hours about this, but I think Welby's undoing was that he loved the status. There was a brilliant article in The Spectator about him, and basically what you realised in the end was that the place he most wanted to be was in the House of Lords chamber. And he wasn't actually that interested in being a pastor. And the irony is that actually he was only a pastor for 2 or 3 years. He always worked in cathedrals and things.
I think one of the most helpful things that you brought today is this entire question of the numinous, the numinal. It's Martin Buber who speaks about the narrative in Exodus 1, that inside the first aggressive assault against the people of God is one person's decision to have genocide. And it's the new king who knew not Joseph.
Yeah.
And that residual sense of assault, of evil, inside organizations forever has found its genesis in an individual. And I think that's the incarnational imposition of having to deal with God who comes, is that he places himself in the middle of the time bomb. He comes to the very place of the darkness, of denial. And I just think that whatever we've tried to say in art or in music or in paint or in expression is as a result of something that essentially has been the loving kindness of God.
I completely agree. Completely agree with that. I would say that just to sort of throw in, we can talk about this later though, I think I'm nervous of being too individualistic. I think my African brothers would say, hang on a minute, what about the Corinthian letters? What about being the body? You can't escape from the bigger than the individual, and we all need each other. We are different limbs, blah, blah, blah. And the real wrestling there is the relationship between the institution that's inevitable. You've got to have organization if you have more than a few people, otherwise it's chaos. And the relationship between the institution and the body. And of course, Catholicism merges the two and says the body is the institution. Well, if you're Protestant, you reject that. And I guess there's going to be a spectrum even in this room as to where we might put ourselves. But I think it's one of the things that, because we are Western enlightened, effectively people, we never really know what to do with the corporate. And I think a very good illustration of this is a total red herring I'm going to throw out and not allow you to comment on. We never talk about institutional and corporate sin. I looked in Grudem, the big Grudem systematic, and he's got something like 90 pages on sin, and I think it's 1 paragraph or 2 paragraphs on corporate sin. But you read Amos or the book of Revelation, you think about the king of Tyre and trading. How on earth do you uphold your integrity as a believer in God in the old or new covenant when you have to do business with the king of Tyre and the entire system is corrupt? Obviously, in the Greek cities, the believers had to figure out, well, am I going to eat this meat that's been dedicated to Aphrodite? Or am I going to say, oh, well, I don't believe in Aphrodite, it's okay? And Paul was remarkably liberal about it. And the fascinating thing is when Paul is talking about the strong and the weak there, it's the opposite of what we think. The strong person is the more liberal one. The weak person is the one who has tight rules. But for the sake of that tight rule, weak brother, you say, okay, well, I won't eat this. But you see, it's not just about religion, it's about business. The temple court in Ephesus or wherever, that's where you did your business deals. So if you don't believe in all that stuff and you say, actually, no, I'm a Christian now, I've rejected that, you are withdrawing from the stock market. You're saying, okay, I'm no longer going to trade in stocks. I'm going to withdraw my name from Lloyd's or whatever it is. You're saying, I can have no part of this. But then suddenly, how do you earn a living? And you know, it's huge, but this is really knotty. And because you cannot give a soundbite answer to that in a sermon conclusion, I think that's why we avoid it, because it's too complicated. You say, okay, well, let's just talk about lust. That's much easier, and we can really hammer people for that. Anyway, you're not allowed to talk about that. I'm going to talk about Coleridge.
Can I just say, I do think your characterization of evangelicalism is slightly too far one way. Evangelicalism was a reaction to the Enlightenment, but it was born out of a sort of romantic response in the sense of, Wesley, heart strangely warm. It was based in the experience of the individual, which then took rational form. So it was much more that merger of the two coming together than you've suggested. It was not a pure, in fact, it was a response to the Enlightenment rather than defined in that sense.
That's as maybe. Yeah, no, that's fair. But I would say this, I'm trying to sort of grasp what we are now.
Can I?
Okay, very quick.
Well, just why is C.S. Lewis so appealing to Tim Keller, John Grudem, the kind of the leading figures, if you like, particularly in American evangelicalism? They're turning to a guy who is not an evangelical, who is bringing in medieval culture, because he believed that he could communicate the gospel better in a world where there's poetic meaning. And the fact that C.S. Lewis satisfies an appetite among many evangelicals gives at least some force to your argument. There is a hunger there for something more, which is not to sort of undermine your exegesis. These are guys who are leading figures in seeking to apply the word. But it's really saying that when we hear propositional truth, it's always in a context, and the context that you set in your church, the worship, the prayer, the fellowship, the community, all of that is part of the context in which you preach the word exegetically. You never have the word on its own. You never have the word without tradition, community, art even, because God says, speak the truth to one another. How? In psalms, hymns and spiritual songs. Scripture tells us that when we are living filled with the Holy Spirit within a church, we will speak the word, not simply through reading out quotes from Louis Berkhof's dry as dust systematic theology, but by singing it to each other. I think that's it's that trying to bring these two things together of there are facts in Scripture, what we saw, heard and touched, but that's not presented as a scientific paper, that's presented as a story.
And that reminds me of that great thing that Lewis talks about, reflecting on his conversion and the sort of walks he went off around Magdalen Deer Park with Tolkien and stuff. He says his problem, and he felt completely sort of divided. He was clearly a brilliant scholar and mind. And he described how the things he loved growing up as a child and as a young man, the things that he loved, the sagas, the sort of Scandinavian sagas and the great epic poems and, the world of fairies and all this sort of stuff, absolutely adored. But he said, I knew that it was false, but I loved it. And then everything I knew to be true, because he'd had this tutor, the Knock, who was sort of brutally philosophically rigid and materialist, and forced a rigor in logic on Lewis that actually was the making of him in many ways, because he never lost that. But he said, everything I knew to be true left me feeling utterly cold and dead. So the things that made me come alive, I knew to be false, and the things that I knew to be true left me cold. And he loved the world of legends, but he knew the world of facts. And it was Tolkien, particularly, and Barfield and one or two others who made it very clear to him. He says, no, you can still believe in legends and myth, because there's actually a true myth. And myth is not the opposite of truth. And so there you have the integration of the two sides. You think myth is just on the right-hand side. But Tolkien said, no, there's a true myth. And it's fascinating, he never went the whole hog to Tolkien's Catholicism. And, there are people sort of speculate, maybe it's because he was a sort of true Ulster Prot deep down. But whatever it is, it was the merger of the two. And what I found really exciting is when I sort of picked up on this, and it was Malcolm Guite who first helped me to see this. He's written a couple of books about this. Basically, it's Coleridge who set Lewis straight, because once he'd made that sort of connection, he was then looking for people who had done this before. And the crucial thing is that Coleridge got there 150 years before. Let me give you an example. So this is from the beginning of the joint product that he worked on with Wordsworth. And it's interesting, it went through various editions and it became more and more Wordsworth by the end and less Coleridge, but that says a lot about Wordsworth and not about Coleridge. But anyway, to begin with, it was a joint project. Coleridge explains what he is trying to do in writing poems about daffodils or whatever it is. He says, I want to excite a feeling that is analogous to the supernatural. It's like coming face to face with God or the noumenal. It's going to be like that. But it's not that. He's not saying, when you look at a daffodil, you're suddenly in the presence of God. But he's saying it has something of a similar effect. Why? Because how's he going to do this? By awakening the mind's attention to the lethargy of custom. What that means is, you walk down your street 1,000 times and you don't notice stuff in it because you've walked, whether it's to get to the bus or whatever it is, you go along it 1,000 times and, if someone asked you to describe, how many trees are in your street? Oh, I think they're probably about 5 or 6 or whatever. And, how many houses have sort of gardens in front of their houses? And you might be able to have an estimate and stuff, but you're never really looking at them because you're going to the bus. And basically, custom, doing something a lot, makes you lethargic, sleepy. Lethe was one of the rivers of death. And so basically, when you're asleep, you're vacant. You're not aware of anything around you. So the lethargy of custom is that basically you've fallen asleep and you're not noticing because you've done it every day of the year. And so he's saying, I'm going to write a poem to wake you up from that. And directing the mind's attention again, so we're still thinking the mind's attention, directing it to the loveliness and the wonders of the world before us. Well, what is that? Well, it's an inexhaustible treasure. You can never get to the bottom of it. There's always more to go wow to once you start looking. But the lethargy of custom, you don't look. And then he sort of reinforces the point, but for which, in consequence, what it's saying there is, in consequence of the film of familiarity. What does he mean by that? Well, he's not talking about the cinema, that hadn't been invented yet. Film is like that very sort of thin thing you might get on a pond that a little insect can walk on, so it looks like it's walking on water, or actually more relevantly, it's like someone with a cataract. It's this very thin film over the eye that makes everything either blurred or invisible. The film of familiarity, okay, there it is again. It's another way of putting lethargy of custom. We've seen it, and therefore we don't see it. But it's not just the fact that we've got a cataract. It's also selfish solicitude, which is a very sort of roundabout way of basically saying sin. In other words, not only do we not see stuff because we're over used to it, but also there are times when we have an interest in not seeing stuff. I was born in London. London is my home. I feel a centre of gravity. We moved out of London 7 years ago. I still deeply miss it. But it is one of the most extraordinary and appalling shames that our capital is littered with homeless people. Pretty much every doorway. In winter, it can be snowing. There'll be people sleeping outside. And I guess it's the same of the big cities all over the country. And you know how it is. With the best will in the world, you'll be walking down the street and you are in a rush. And you will make sure you don't see who's there. You'll look at your watch or you'll run on or whatever. I remember seeing a documentary that a journalist, I think he was a Guardian journalist, basically as a kind of experiment decided that, set out he was going to sleep on the streets of London for a week with nothing. He left bank cards, he was going to have nothing. He was going to try and do exactly what it would be like. And it was incredibly tough, but I've never forgotten the thing he said at the end. He said, the thing that was most crushing was the loneliness, obviously just by being alone on the streets, but the loneliness that was the direct result of nobody looking you in the eye. And that is heartbreaking. No one looks you in the eye. And so now, I have my excuses for not giving money, and there are good reasons not to, but sometimes I think, well, stuff that, I'm going to give this guy something. But I do try now to look them in the eye and just acknowledge their existence. I would say that's selfish solicitude. I don't want to see it. So it's not a morally neutral business, this, actually. And Coleridge gets this very early on. This is before he comes back to faith. His father had been a vicar. But at this point, he's full-blown romantic, and he was beginning to explore setting up communes. I think they had designs of setting up a commune somewhere in Snowdonia or something, and it never came to anything. It was bonkers. But, all these sort of ideals and stuff. But he gets this, that actually we're not neutral. There is an agenda that we have. And he says this, that actually, basically, we have eyes, yet see not, ears that hear not, and hearts that neither feel nor understand. Does that ring a bell? There's no question where that's derived. He's writing, this is about writing a poem. But this is weighty, isn't it? This is big. Isn't that what, well, I'm a preacher. Isn't that what we're doing as preachers? But actually, I would argue that this is pretty much every profession. Isn't this what a school teacher does? Is this what any artist does? Isn't this actually also what a scientist does? A friend of my wife's family was working in the Oxford AstraZeneca project during COVID, and they came up with a radical vaccine. And because AstraZeneca is a sort of Swiss-British company, it was a minnow compared to all the big guns. And they got completely outflanked by the big ones. And there was a lot of propaganda against AstraZeneca during COVID. I don't know whether you remember this. But it was pretty brutal. We sort of picked up some of the inside experience of that. But others here will know exactly what was involved. But they came up with a radically different approach to creating a vaccine. It was completely, all the others were following sort of various tried and tested routes, but this AstraZeneca one was completely different, and it worked. Arguably, some would say better than the others. I don't know any of the stats or research or anything, but we forget that actually it could have been entirely possible that no vaccines were found. And, who knows? We could have still been in some kind of sort of situation where COVID was rife, and okay, we wouldn't have had full lockdowns, but there would be all kinds of restrictions, no doubt, still. And here we are 5 years on, almost. But they did find them. Now, how did they find them? Well, basically, it was people who spent their adult lives probably staring down staring down microscopes, thinking about coronaviruses, and saying, we've got to think about this differently. Isn't that exactly what this is? The lethargy of custom. We've looked at this virus a gazillion times, but we're going to have to look at it again and look at it differently. But actually, this is about living life in the world. It doesn't matter what realm you're in, but artists help us do this. There's so many things, but I haven't got time. Let me end with some music. Well, I do want to say a couple of things, and then we'll have a break, because I do want to give some time to Shostakovich, because people are scared of him. For no reason, really. We'll break in 5 minutes. Yeah, let's go to 1:30, and then we'll have a break for coffee, okay? Okay, so Vaughan Williams. I'm not going to play anything, because we're going to do a big, deep dive into Vaughan Williams yesterday, but I adore Vaughan Williams. 2 years ago was his 150th anniversary, something like that?
Yeah, something like that.
Sounds plausible. No, I mean, you're not going to say anything, are you? There's a wonderful moment where this is very odd, he rejected all sort of honours, he rejected knighthoods and stuff. The only honour he accepted was to be a companion of honour, which is a private gift of the monarch. So he accepted that, but basically all his life he was just Professor Vaughan Williams. And he was a great mentor to many, many people. Just a fascinating and a really humane person. I could wax lyrical about that, particularly his relation to Ivor Gurney, but that's a whole other story. He drove ambulances during the First World War, so yet another one, like Tolkien and Lewis and so many others, who were profoundly scarred by that war. Anyway, after the Second World War, he had this very odd honour paid him, where a girls' boarding school in Norfolk that he had no connections with whatsoever suddenly said they're going to name one of the girls' boarding houses after him. So they've got Vaughan Williams House now. Random, I mean, you know, okay, great. So he sort of thought, I better sort of write to them and say thank you and maybe say something about music. So in this letter to the school, he says this about music. Music will enable you to see past facts to the very essence of things. Just think about that phrase so far. Music will help you see, but it's an entirely audible art form, essentially. And see past facts, but I thought facts were all there were. No, there's something beyond facts that's still equally true, in a way which science cannot do. Well, that's interesting. That fits into precisely what we started with. The arts are the means by which we can look through the magic casements and see what lies beyond. Casement, old word for, sash windows. And sash windows have this huge sort of structure around it to enable the pulleys, and usually they don't work, and so those windows are incredibly heavy and annoying. We can see beyond the casements, not just to the garden, but to the things that really matter, the essence of things. Music can do that. Well, talk about mixing your metaphors. What's going on there? He's talking about truth and music as a means of communication about reality. But let's go to another composer who's still alive and is a proud Scot, James Macmillan, and he's written a little book on basically what I picked it up in Toppings in St Andrews when I first came and stayed with the Sterlings. It's a lovely little book. I can't remember exactly the title. It's something like A Life in Music or something. And I think he is acknowledged as probably one of the 3 best living British composers. I don't know whether you watched the Queen's funeral. Musically, it was a feast, much more than the coronation. Some of the music in the coronation was dire, I thought. But anyway, that's the whole thing. But he had written an anthem that had been specifically commissioned for the funeral 15 years before. So he wrote it and it was put in a safe and he was not allowed to tell anybody. And then when the Queen dies, it gets taken out of the safe and then they perform it. And it's astonishing. It's a setting of Romans 8. Nothing can separate us from the love of God. What a wonderful thing to have at a funeral. And it was my musical highlight of the whole thing. It is glorious. He said this: music has the power to look into the abyss as well as to the transcendent heights. It can trigger the most severe and conflicting extremes of feeling, and it is in these dark and dingy places where the soul is probably closest to its source, where it has its relationship with God, that music can spark life that has long lain dormant. In other words, music can invade. It can come in under the radar and grab you by the lapels without you realizing it was going to do it. And the perfect illustration of that is what I mentioned with William Styron yesterday. He was about to kill himself. And some Brahms just suddenly stop. And as someone, so I've been on antidepressants now for, it's 20 years now. This is my 20th anniversary of being on happy pills. And I'm still here. Hallelujah. I would say there have been times when music is the only thing that's kept me going. I would say my obsession is the band U2. I would say there are times when U2 is the only thing that kept me Christian. I am not exaggerating. And the worst times of my depression were when I lost music. That was the darkest, and it sometimes I get hints of it again, and it is the worst. So I completely resonate with that. So I want to play you a short piece. It's a setting of an Advent liturgy from the Middle Ages. It speaks for itself. It's for unaccompanied choir. It's one of the so-called Strathclyde motets. He has a strong relationship with the Catholic chaplaincy at the University of Strathclyde, and for several years they've commissioned him each year to write a motet for them. There are now, I think there are about 13 or 14 maybe. Might have got that wrong, but this one I think is one of the most glorious things. And I want you to, I'll put the text up there as well. I want you to see if you can discern what he's doing musically to bring the words to greater force, if I can put it like that. Glory! Let's have coffee.